We do love our poetry. First, The Sunrise Ruby by Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, that 13th century Persian Sufi mystic. In the early morning hour, just before dawn, lover and beloved wake and take a drink of water. She asks, do you love me or yourself more, really? Tell the absolute truth. He says, there is nothing left of me. I am like a ruby held up to the sunrise. Is it still a stone or a world made of redness? It has no resistance to sunlight. This is how Hadewijch said, I am God, and spoke the truth. The ruby and the sunrise are one. Be courageous and discipline yourself. Completely become a hearing and ear and wear this sun ruby as an earring. Work. Keep digging your well. Don't think about getting off from work. Water is there somewhere. Submit to a daily practice. Your loyalty to that is a ring on the door. Keep knocking, and the joy inside will eventually open a window and look out to see who is there. And another poem by a temporal contemporary of Rumi from a different tradition and a different place far to the north in the lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands, from Hadewijch of Antwerp, the Beguine. The madness of love. The madness of love is a blessed fate, and if we understood this, we would seek no other. It brings into unity that which was divided, and this is the truth. Bitterness it makes sweet, it makes the stranger a neighbor, and what was lowly it raises on high. The madness of love, and the love that Rumi speaks of. In this poem and in others, both in Rumi and Hadewijch's canon of work, it strikes to me, in my admittedly cursory reading of that body of literature that could be considered mystic poetry, this common thread, this unitive desire with love, a belonging beyond belonging, a longing for belonging, if you will. This is true for Rumi who writes about how he feels the tension of desire and yet not ever being able to quite find that unification with ultimacy in this life, this frustration, this tension. Perhaps you have tried a new spiritual practice and eventually found yourself frustrated with it because it just didn't seem to be sticking for you. Rumi is dealing with that all the time. And so is Hadewijch in many ways. Her theology, her poetry, like really all mystics, is resistant to summary, to say the least. If only for the fact that she is this highly curated and systematic way of approaching her faith. Coming from a Catholic Christian context from the 13th century, we know very little of Hadewijch's life, although we shockingly have basically all of what she wrote as radical and maybe heretical, but we're Unitarian Universalists. Who doesn't love a good heresy here? But for 800 years, her work just went under the radar, not suppressed, just kind of forgotten in Middle Dutch, and then became translated into High German, and then in the 1980s became available in English. And yet we know very little about her life, except for what we can infer from her work, which is a couple of things that are interesting. One, she is likely from an educated household, fluent in French and Latin, the courtly love poetry of France, and she was a leader in the Beguine movement of the 13th century. Now we think about the Dark Ages, the 13th century, as this sort of dour time, and certainly that was the case for many people. But it was also a time of Fibonacci, and the Beguines. Thomas Aquinas, Rumi, in a different part of the world, also in the 13th century. So a lot was happening back then, y'all. A lot of perhaps even polarizing things, where the Beguines were not just like an order of nuns or anything. These were lay women who took vows unto themselves to form communities of mutual aid, to live into that Vita Apostolica movement, that movement that called for a life of piety and charity and poverty frequently. So they lived together, usually in inner cities, where they tried to emulate the life of Jesus by tending to the infirm, by educating children, by protecting and sheltering sex workers, Jesus stuff. attempting to emulate the life of Jesus in these groups together. Now, you can only imagine how polarizing a group of literate, liberated women were in 13th century Europe. Some bishops and cardinals and nobles welcomed the Beguines with open arms, but more than a few of them met persecution and were accused of heresy, with all of the consequences that entails. This doesn't seem to be the case for Hadewijch, although we do find that she leaves her beguinage. We're not really sure why. Some scholars believe that perhaps her spiritual athleticism and her intensity was just too much for her sisters. And so they were like, go away. There's too much for us. And indeed, she is intense. And when I lift up Hadewijch today, it's not so much as a thing that we must or should or emulate, but to consider, well, I can't lift up all of her work. Like I said, resists summary. And this is, I do not have 2 hours to talk about Hadewijch, so I'll cut to the quick as best I can. It's more about her philosophy on what grounds our being in the world that I find to be particularly compelling for us, especially as we're considering this reevaluation of our principles from this tiered list into this circle, with love at the center and justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, generosity, orbiting around it, but with love at the center. And when I see this shape, what comes to my mind is Hadewijch's articulation of love as a whirlpool, pulling all things home towards the center, the abyss of love. Now, Hadewijch draws a syllogism from the Bible in John, where it is said God is love, and from the book of Acts that says God is the ground of being in which we have our life in the Christian context. Hadewijch says, well, okay, if God is love and God is the ground of being, then love is the ground of being. The ontological register from which we know and experience the world. Love is all that there is to Hadewijch, and the only response we can have to that love is love. Now, this isn't a cheap love, y'all, or I wouldn't be talking about it to you. It is a love that runs the full spectrum of the phenomenological expression of life, from the gentle sweetness of that first touch with divinity or the love of a neighbor, and the passionate intensities that burn and hurt, and the melancholy and the madness that can accompany separation from love. Indeed, at the bottom of Hadewijch's process by which we come to encounter that transcendent love, which she calls Minna, das Minna es all. Love is everything for Hadewijch. Love is everything, the primary stuff of the world. When I am thinking about what this could mean for us today, and I'm thinking about how we are exploring a reevaluation of our principles with love at the center, which largely has a social justice connotation. When we're doing that with our principles, we're saying, well, justice is love in action. But I think there's some theological meat here for us too. For what is love? But relationality. But togetherness. One's love is a desire for another. For Hadewijch, it is an unattainable desire for unity with ultimacy, with the God of her understanding, with Minna. For Rumi, it's very similar. Rumi speaks of unification with the beloved. There is no resistance. Is it still a stone or a world made of redness? There is no separation. But for Hadewijch, there is. Throughout her systematic theology, she reaches the ends of her philosophy, and yet she has this flow of Minna circulating between her and ultimacy, and yet it isn't enough for Hadewijch, because the subject-object distinction persists, and there is this suffering. One might think of what the Buddha says about desire and attachment as the root of suffering. Far away in time and space, likely never having read other of one's works, nonetheless, they come to this similar conclusion, that it is the over-attachment of a desire that causes us to feel pain like this. And so Hadewijch, at the end, advocates for like an unfaith, which is kind of surprising. For Hadewijch, she says she must betray love in order to feel love at all. But in this letting go of this desire, the shape of the soul for Hadewijch takes on that whirlpool form too, being open to the world coming into oneself. And so Hadewijch understands that there isn't really a separation, because it is all fundamentally one, still ultimately love. Now, this can have some pretty big transcendent implications, and we are really only beginning to understand what Hadewijch's writing may have on the spiritual life and growth and impact of people in our time. She's only been translated into English since the 80s. It's just a little bit older than I am. And yet, for us, for a tradition whom, when polled in mass, will so often say, love is the center of who we are. When we read our covenant, loosely adapted from James Villa Blake, we say, love is the center, love is the spirit of our church. I believe we benefit from any and all articulations of love as they may be experienced and expressed throughout the course of history. Throughout other thinkers and other traditions, there's always something to learn, right? Our sources expand beyond and beyond, kind of like an abyss all on their own, not a pit of skittering demons or scary things, but just a vastness, y'all. The potentialities of us to touch onto something new that could move our hearts. And in having our hearts moved, move us to move the hearts of others. May this be so. I do love a fun sound. May this be so, friends. Today, in this space, and in all places you may go, you face a sickness and disaster like this. It almost feels out of character to speak of something like love in the way we often condition love. What is loving about this? What is loving about this world when it hurts so much? When there are wars brewing abroad and fires burning overseas, which we can feel the heat from here. Not to be too edgy, friends, but practically hear the screams of those folks crying out for it to stop, whatever that looks like, whether that's local or abroad. This world can sure seem pretty unloving. What could Hadewijch and these mystics possibly mean when they say that love is this primary ontological register? And I mentioned it briefly before. Consider that relatedness. The relationality of things does not always generate the warm fuzzies or the easy path, but it is what is. I don't necessarily think we need hard supernaturalisms to come to this conclusion. Consider your body. What are you made of? Stuff, bones, organs, chemicals, chemistry. From the toe to tip, and far beneath us, let's say there's water in your body, 2 hydrogen atoms, oxygen. Is there a chemist in the house? Did I get that right? Good. The relationship between these forces creating something new, something wet that can freeze, that can be in blood and breath, that can be the stuff of life. The components of that that molecule of water are themselves made up of atoms, made of quarks held together by gluons. The bottom of everything, friends, it would seem to me that not necessarily in the most human light, but things are fundamentally relational. And it is through relationships that all things come into being. Hadewijch extends this to love, this big love, and Hadewijch understands that there is this sweetness and this burning, this thing that threatens to undo us, that will undo us ultimately. And Hadewijch's procession of how one encounters this kind of all-consuming love, she moves from the bond, the recognition of the bond, to where our reason and our wisdom are purified for Hadewijch in the light of this love. And then we encounter, well, the embers, when we start to feel like we're on fire for something. And then we become the actual fire where all things are undone, and it is pure madness. There is no distinction between reason or wisdom or love. It is all one. And then Hadewijch presents the dew, like dew on grass, when the fire is extinguished and the first touch of sweetness with divinity is encountered. Then surging waters, where there is this reciprocal feedback loop with minna, with love, with ultimacy in the self. And this persistence of separation remains. And this, for Hadewijch, can hurt. I reckon for just about anybody, when we think about what keeps us separate from one another, we can find a wound. We can find a wound. And it is in the desiring for this that she is finding this sense of suffering, this unfaith, this letting go of this desire, of this expectation, is how she is liberating herself from this maelstrom being tossed around like a plaything. And I wonder what that looks like in like real world applications, because this is the thing about mystics. It can be pretty hard to dig past the surface to find where is the value. For us as Unitarian Universalists, for sure, but I reckon as we're exploring this recentering of our values, we're thinking about what it is that makes social justice such an important pillar of our community and who we are. It's that love in action, that love moving in the world. Sometimes when you are actually, I would say most of the time when you're doing social justice, one is behooved to let go of hard expectations, to know that sometimes things do not go our way. This is not a reason to sit on our hands and do nothing. Unfaith is not apathy, not for Hadewijch. No, it's a deeper participation in the ontology of love, that one may really experience love. I don't know about y'all, but if you've been to a protest, you've been to a rally, you've been with your people here advocating for love in the Capitol or on the street or in a garden or in a conversation with a friend, you are participating in a love that is bigger than you. Now, whether that's hard-coded into reality for you or simply something you experience in kinship with others, I believe doesn't really matter so much. What matters is that love have a means of expression in the world, and love can only be expressed by us, really. Whether it's hard-coded in the world or not, we are a vehicle by which love may be expressed. Consider the ways in which we've explored love this month. Dr. King's articulation of love without power being sentimental and anemic, power without love being reckless and abusive. How we very seriously picked apart the Barbie movie to consider the question, what is it that we are if we're not our girlfriend or our house? We're not all these things we pile on top of each other. What are we in the bottom of everything? Then we came to this poem, which I'll read to you here in just one moment, that would call us beloved first, would say this is where we start. So perhaps it's carved into atoms, and perhaps it's held in the hand. Perhaps we just invent ideas like love to make sense of the mess of this world, like we invent so many ideas. No matter what is capital T true here, friends, I am more interested in the impact that love and its expressions can have on us as individuals and this world as a whole, because we know it needs it. We know it needs it. And we know that sometimes love's move is to back off and to step back and to make room for things to grow and to heal. We know that sometimes love is called into the thick of things, into the struggle, and that no matter what, we may be struggling with love there. Love in its motions, its requirements, its calls. But before our closing song by Peter Meyer, God is a River, it's a new one for us to sing together, friends. We'll work through it briefly before we sing. I want to reprise this poem that we read last Sunday. Beloved is where we begin. If you would enter into the wilderness, do not begin without a blessing. Do not leave without hearing who you are, beloved. Named by the one who has traveled this path before you, do not go without letting it echo in your ears. And if you find it is hard to let into your heart, do not despair. That is what this journey is for. I cannot promise this blessing will free you from danger, from fear, from hunger or thirst, from scorching of sun or the fall of the night. But I can tell you that on this path there will be help. I can tell you that on this way there will be rest. I can tell you that you will know the strange graces that come to our aid only on a road such as this, that fly to meet us, bearing comfort and strength, that come alongside us for no other cause than to lean themselves against our ear, and with their curious insistence, whisper our name, beloved, beloved, beloved. Amen. and blessed be.